Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to today's class. The title of today's class is Self and Experience in Ayurveda Clinical Practice. As part of the Philosophy, Self and Consciousness, Exploring the Context of Experience course, organized by the Consciousness Studies program at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. So this course is interdisciplinary in nature, and it is conceptualized by Dr. Sankita Menon. And we have many eminent faculty who will be engaging us in these sessions. And the modules are designed in such a manner that we will be looking at self and experience in philosophy, aesthetics, indigenous systems of healthcare, experience in social sciences, in psychology and psychiatry, and also experience in literature. So today, Dr. Gangadharan was expected to take the session, but unfortunately, due to some unforeseen emergency, he could not make it. Instead, Dr. Pushya will be engaging us for the session. And a few words about Dr. Pushya. Dr. Pushya Gautama is an MD in Ayurveda. She did both her undergrad and masters from SDM College of Ayurveda, Hassan. She was a university gold medalist for both her undergraduation and post-graduation. She underwent a transformative one-year internship under the aegis of the late Padma Shri P.R. Krishnakumarji and learnt Ayurveda informally for a year under various formal and traditional Vaidyas. After her MD, she worked briefly at the Ramaya Ayurveda Hospital under Dr. G.G. Gangadharan before joining NIAS as a doctoral scholar. She is currently working under Professor Sankita Menon to understand the intersections between well-being and consciousness from an Ayurvedic perspective. It is indeed a pleasure to introduce you, Dr. Pushya, and we look forward to your lecture today. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Meera, for such a kind introduction. Let me first say, for all of you who are looking forward to Dr. Gangadharan's lecture, I'm sorry, because he had an urgent meeting at the PMO, no less, today. And so he requested if I could speak instead of him. It was very, very last minute. And so I have not had very much time to prepare a PPT or anything, but I'm very happy to address you all. Often you see me on the other side. So today you see me here. So let me begin. So I don't have a PPT or anything. I'm just going to be talking to you today. And just 1 minute. Okay. So I have had close to 9 years of practice. Because as an Ayurved, it's never only theory. So from the second year of our undergraduation, we start practicing. Practicing in the sense you are not the treating physician, but you start seeing patients on an intense basis, all through internship. And then, of course, in MD, it's more of actually only seeing patients and your thesis work or whatever. So after that, also for the year I spent in Ramaya and the year I spent learning informally, there was a lot of clinical exposure. So, and of course, this is not the 35-year experience that, let's say, someone like Dr. G.G. Gangadharan might have had, but it is something that allows me to speak a little bit about the kind of cases I have seen. And through this talk, what I will be doing is just speaking about my experience as an Ayurveda physician, drawing again from a number of cases that I have seen, and I will also be presenting these cases briefly to you. And I'm going to speak about this in the context of experiences or lessons that the physician, the patient, and also their relationship that evolves through this engagement. I think, like was said in the abstract, the topic, the minute you bring in something like experience in clinical practice, there's no prescription that is possible in this area, in the sense that you can't say that this is how it is and therefore everybody should do this, or if everybody does this, this is the result they'll get. So this is just something that is uniquely personal. I had interacted with Dr. Gigi actually 2-3 times over the past week about what he would like to say. So a couple of cases that I present are cases that he himself would have presented before you had he been here. And I found them very interesting and thought I would anyway present them before you. So just to begin, let me begin with one anecdote from Dr. Gigi's experience that he was sharing with me just 3 days back. This is a case of a patient who had suffered a stroke. He had suddenly developed a case of very severe rheumatoid arthritis, which is a very painful inflammatory condition of the joints. And his vision was very poor. His vital functions were dropping, and he'd practically been written off in the hospital, allopathic hospital that he had been admitted in. And this was in Chennai, I think. And so he was advised, he was basically a resident of Bangalore, and he was advised as a last resort measure to go and get admitted in the Ayurveda hospital in Bangalore, which is it's the Institute of Ayurveda and Indigenous Medicine. It's in Yelahanka. And Dr. Gigi, who was the treating physician there, came to know later on that he had been advised to come there because that was closer to the crematorium than where he stayed in Bangalore. So that was how he landed up in Ayurveda. And unfortunately or fortunately, this is a case of at least about 30 to 40%, maybe even 50% of the case burden that comes to Ayurveda hospitals. Most often they are cases who have been written off by allopathy, people who were unsatisfied with allopathy, and even sometimes with other systems of medicine like homeopathy or whatever. I mean, and I'm sure that happens reverse as well. So this is not a claim of any kind, but that is a fact. So this patient came to the hospital, and nobody was expecting anything great. And Dr. Gangadharan, the way he described this, he was not sure he would even speak about this case because he didn't want to sound like he was tooting his own horn, but I can speak about it. And so what he said was that I looked at that patient and I felt that, if Ayurveda can't help this man, then I don't know who it can help. This was just a thought that came to him at that point. And he started treating the patient. He gave the patient internal medication. Internal medication at that point was impossible. So it was only external treatments that were possible. And within 1 week, the patient had opened his eyes. Up till then, he'd been unconscious. And within 3 months, the patient was walking, albeit with support. And within 6 months, he was jogging and he was completely back to his regular lifestyle and habits. And I mean, I'm not going into the therapy or what happened or how the case was diagnosed or anything. But what is interesting here, I think, is what Dr. Gigi said about how he felt that he ought to help this patient. And it was not this case of where he felt personally linked to the patient in any way, in the sense that he had a personal kind of connect with the patient, or that he was deeply moved by the patient's status, which is all a very explainable emotional reaction to a patient or his state. But this was more like a commitment to healing, that Ayurveda ought to work. So you're committed, and you're invested, but not in the person, but in the process of healing. And I found this very interesting kind of distinction, because often in the medical practice, we tend to draw these very fuzzy lines saying, how far is too far when you're relating to a patient? Is there such a thing as getting too close to somebody? Because, is that even healthy? And would that even help the patient? For instance, in allopathy, it's very clear that there's a very clear line. You should not get close to a patient emotionally or in any, kind of personal way. Whereas in Ayurveda, given that it is an individualized system and that you do build a rapport with each case, you do see each person as independent. Given that, how does one build a rapport with the person? How do you establish a distance that is both personal and impersonal? So these are questions I think that all practitioners, and I think certainly accomplished practitioners, have addressed and managed in some way to overcome. And I think this example is one where this idea of being impersonally invested is something that is very important, and something that I was very interested by, and something that I have found come up repeatedly in my own career. that you're not invested in the person, because that tends to get very, very messy. But you are invested in the process of healing, and that communicates, and that probably also drives this process of healing. So this is just one point that I would like to, start with. And the second area that I would like to speak to is this relationship that maybe one establishes between the physician and the patient. Now that comes up as a direct link from what I said before. So how, given that it is an individualized system, how would a physician or conceive of this patient-physician relationship in a clinical setup? What would it entail? What are the nuances of it? And is it not a case-by-case thing? So as I said, it is a case-by-case thing, and therefore it is absolutely unprescriptive, but something that one learns and one sees different nuances of. So I'll just again speak about 5 different cases that I have seen that maybe demonstrate different aspects of this physician-patient relationship, given that the topic and the area of interest is this idea of experience in clinical practice of Ayurveda. I will also speak a little bit about maybe the difference between an experience of a patient as well as the experience of a physician. So those are the areas that I will be speaking about today. So coming to the first case, this was the case of a patient with cancer. She had breast cancer and she had been operated for the cancer and it had been removed. And I think as a result of the very intense radiotherapy and chemotherapy that she had to have, as well as her advanced age, she was around 72 when she had the surgery. She had severe joint pain. So when she presented in our OPD, she had very severe joint pain. She had pain in the back, the neck, the knees. She came in actually on a wheelchair because she was unable to walk. Her vision was also failing her. And she had extremely, which is to be expected, excuse me. Which is to be expected of someone who's just had chemotherapy and radiotherapy. She had had very severe hair loss. And in this patient, what could we offer? So she basically presented with this complaint of joint pain, saying, is there something that you can, give? And this was when this was in Ramaya Hospital, again, a patient that Dr. Gangadharan saw, and I was with him at that time. And so he gave her a treatment regimen. He gave her internal medication. And within 3 months, the joint pain had completely gone. And this was observed both through radiological, in radiological evidence, because she'd shown, signs of just, arthritis at its very initial stages. Also, the swelling and the inflammation in the joints had gone. She was able to flex and extend her knees and her shoulder and elbows far more easily, all sort of demonstrating that, her joint function was certainly better and the pain was certainly much less. She was not wincing, and she was also able to walk within 3 months. So technically the complaint that she came to us for had completely gone. And she was, well in that sense. But to this day, and this is close to a year since I saw her first, and she still, Dr. Gigi says that she still continues to come, if not twice a week, at least once a year, once a month. And he described this process very beautifully. So she'll call him, and that itself is, a process, because she calls him at some time, she'll fix up time with him, call him at 6:30, call him at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And he, of course, he's a man who, if he doesn't answer immediately, then he'll call back at some point. So, and for her, he'll always make an exception and pick up whenever she calls. So it matters a lot to her that there's somebody who takes her this seriously. And whenever she calls, he will give her an appointment for the next day. He says, okay, fine, come tomorrow at 11 o'clock. So there's no making her wait. There's no, making her fight for an appointment, make her feel like she's, burdening the physician, though she's well, which all tends to happen, especially in a busy clinical setup. And sometimes after she gets this kind of reassurance, she won't even land up, because I think somewhere it was just this reassurance that he provided, this saying that, hey, I'm there, certainly please do drop in, I'd love to see you. And I think that makes a very big difference. And again, without getting prescriptive, I can't analyze it beyond this, because there's no saying what it means to her, what this dynamic is, because I mean, it varies from person to person. So to just reduce it to saying, yeah, people like being listened to or something sounds like a very romanticized and dumbed down version of what it actually is. So I think that in this particular case, I think just having somebody there for her made a difference. And the healing was as much in the fact that he was there for her as the medicines that he gave, perhaps more. So this relationship between the physician and the patient, in this sense, being there in a very impersonal, but being there for the person, I think is something that is often seen in clinical setups, and especially with good physicians. I think there's a feeling that they inspire patients with, especially that they are there for them, that their patients can count on them. And this has, I think, a lot more to do with the mind than with the body, but it does play a very important role in healing. And another related example actually happened during COVID, and this was a case that I myself saw. So there was this person whom I know, who's a friend, who came down with COVID because he just traveled in from abroad or something like that, and he tested positive. And he was really, really cool about it, because he seemed to be one of these asymptomatic COVID cases, and he had absolutely no symptoms. There was no loss of taste, there was no fever, there was no cold, cough, there was nothing. But his wife completely freaked out. I mean, it was like, I'd receive 6-7 calls a day saying, okay, what should I do now? Okay, what should I do now? He's sleeping, is it okay? Or he's just broken into a sweat, is it okay? Or, is it okay if I give him this or if I give him that? Are you sure the medicines won't react? So minimum, at least on the first 3 days, I would get about 6 to 7 calls. And after that, as she realized that, okay, he seems to be fine and nothing seems to be happening much with him. And, he's just the same as he was before. She started calming down. And, over a week after that, she stopped calling me. So, I mean, this is not, I think what I understood from this relationship was that, again, similar to the previous point, that somewhere just being there for someone, helping them sort of navigate what they're in. And I think in this case, the patient was not the guy with COVID, which is really strange, because the person who was most affected was his wife. And I think being there for being there for her, just listening to her, it was not like I had to do anything or actively engage. It was just listening. And again, this is something I find is strangely a very underrated thing in medical practice, which is just this, the importance of listening. I mean, we're not qualified counselors. We really don't, have experience counseling anybody in that sense. But I have found this repeatedly over 8-9 years, that the better listener a physician is, strangely, in many cases at least, the better the healing is. So, and even if, the physical symptoms take some time to improve, so even if they don't improve, because there is no guarantee that every time you treat someone that they're going to get better. But I think there is still healing, because people feel better. They still come back because they want to talk. They still come back because they feel listened to. And I think that this is a very interesting angle to the physician-patient relationship. Again, this brings me to another question, which I will address a little later on, which is the question of, again, how much is too much? So how close is it okay to get to a patient, and what are some of the issues that arise when you get very close to a patient? And I'll maybe speak about them in some of the other examples I speak about. So there was a third case, which actually demonstrates a very different side to the physician-patient relationship, which is where we had, in fact, in our hospital, we used to admit some alcoholics, recovering alcoholics, to help them kick the habit of alcoholism. And now this was something, again, that was a little dangerous, because often people who come in directly, I mean, like they were drinking the previous day and they come in today saying they want to kick the habit. Often that's a little difficult, because most often relapses tend to happen, and maybe the habit can be prevented for 2 to 3 days before they start drinking again. Now, in our hospital, we had a very strict no drinking policy. So this was a little problematic, especially to other patients. And if this, the guy who was admitted or the person who was admitted started creating a ruckus, then that would be, a problem for the whole ward, for the nurses, for the attending staff and everybody. So admitting such people would have to be done with care and on the discretion of the treating physician. So my professor, when I was doing my MD, did admit one such person who came to him and who looked very sincere to him in his desire for, quitting the habit of alcoholism. So this patient was admitted in the ward, and his wife was a very subdued but a very kind of supportive wife to the husband. And there clearly had been some violence, and because in front of him sometimes she would be very afraid to speak. And even when asking about the history of the illness, how frequently he was an alcoholic, she would never answer any of the questions, even if they were directed at her. And sometimes, we would have to catch her somewhere outside when she was getting food or something to ask her, because she would never speak any of the difficult things in front of her husband. So basically the treatment began, and as might be expected, within 3 or 4 days, the nurses started complaining that there had been a lot of ruckus in the previous night, and that the room began to stink of alcohol. And so instead of the next day, usually the rounds were at 9 o'clock. We all went for rounds at around 8:15 in the morning to, just take a look at things and see how they were, and also to surprise him a little bit, because by that time usually they would have cleaned the room a little bit, put agarbatti and all. So we went in, and as the nurses said, the room was actually stinking of alcohol, and he'd obviously drunk the previous night, or had drunk even that morning. So one often thinks that physicians ought to be these just kind, gentle people, especially Ayurveda, when we talk about holism and, mind, body and all of that. Somewhere there's this impression that it always translates into a very benign presence with the patient. And that has been very far from my experience. That might be the intent, but that certainly need not be the manner. Because what happened is, when Sir went and saw the patient, he just looked at that man and he said, "Get out." And that man said, "What?" And he wasn't expecting that, because he was staying in a treatment suite or something, and so in a rather expensive suite. So he was expecting slightly more I don't know I don't know what the word is, but more respectful, for the want of a better word, treatment. And somehow he was very surprised when Sir said, "If this is what you're going to do, get out." So he said, no, sir, I promise, I'm very sorry, this is the last time and all. So, but Sir didn't budge actually. And he just said, if this is what you're going to do, I'll have to call the security, get out. And, till that point, that man had, put up this really lovely act, of sobbing and saying, "Oh, you're my last hope. And if you kick me out, what will I do?" And he actually started crying and all of that. And, but Sir sort of saw through that, and even at the cost of looking very harsh, he stood his ground. And it surprised us as well, because we've seen Sir with alcoholics before, and he'd never been this harsh. So there was something about this man, either that he felt that man could take it, or he felt something would be achieved by being this harsh. We never had that conversation, so to this day I don't know why he behaved the way he did. But somehow when this man was shocked out of his kind of a very sorry, self-pitying location, when Sir kind of shocked him out of it by being rude and in your face. And he said he stopped crying, and it was like a mask dropped, and he just looked at Sir and just looked silent. And then Sir said, "Are you going to leave or not?" And he said, "Sir, please give me one more chance." And Sir said, "Okay, I will give you one more chance, but this is your last chance. And if you're going to do this again, then we'll kick you out." And so he said, "Sir, I promise I will give it a try." And he was there for 3 months after that. And he did not drink even once in that time. And certainly we would have come to know, given that, it's a busy ward, and, nurses and therapists and everybody is walking up and down. And also given that people go for rounds at all crazy hours. So definitely we would have come to know had that been the case. But for the next 3 months, that didn't happen. So I think that another facet of this patient, physician relationship is just this rather interesting angle, where it's not so much what you think you ought to be bringing as much as what will make a difference to the patient at that point in time. And if it means shocking them out of a behavior, it means shocking them out of a pattern, especially with people who are drug and alcohol addicted, then that is the best thing for them. And again, it's a very case by case basis. So this cannot be something that can be prescribed in any way. So I think that this speaks of another facet of the whole patient-physician experience. And this brings me actually to a question that I myself was pondering when thinking of this topic, and I have been discussing this with a couple of my physician friends as well. So how, as a physician, does one learn to distinguish between what you think ought to happen and what is actually right or what is good for the patient? Now, I mean, let me put this before you in the form of an example to make it more clear exactly what I'm talking about. So I mean, we often get these cases, or at least in the college in which I studied in SDM Hassan, we had a number of cases. And we had a number of cases. So we now have they now have, it's not we anymore, but they have a 600 bed hospital, which is the biggest Ayurveda hospital in the country, of course, maybe in the world. And most of those beds are full throughout the year. So there are a number of cases that one gets to see if one studies in a college like that. And I think one of the cases that one repeatedly saw was this case of TAO, or thromboangiitis obliterans, which is basically something that one sees in chronic smokers. So we got this case in our OPD once again during my MD of a guy, and this usually affects the toe, the toes of the big toe, especially of the feet. And basically, the artery, there is a particular artery, the tibial artery, that is blocked. And what happens is that the blood flow to the toe stops and it starts necrosing or disintegrating. And after a point, amputation is probably the only way if the person doesn't stop smoking. So we had this guy enter the OPD, and he was also reeking of smoke. And his wife again came with him, and she was saying, oh, he smokes and he's been fired from his job. And she was feeling very pitying and sorry for him, saying, oh, I'm just a cleaner and I go to houses and clean, and now I have to put my children through school, and he's been fired and all of that. And somehow I found it very difficult. And he was sitting there, feeling very happy in his wife's concern for him, expecting, everyone to feel concern over his plight. And I found it very, very difficult to empathize with him, And there were these thoughts that were going through my mind. And I was just thinking, there are children who suffer, and I feel so much more empathy with children. This man has brought this on himself. He smoked what, 60 BDs a day for 20 years. What does he expect? And he's got children, and he's got, a family that he needs to support. And I found it very, very difficult to empathize with him. So had I been the treating physician, I'm sure there have been a lot more, judgment that came his way, at least at that time. And I found strangely that the doctor who was treating him, she just said, okay, so you smoke 60 BDs a day. So he said, yeah. And she said, have you ever tried to give it up? And he said, no, I've never tried. And, I have tried before, but I always somehow end up getting back to it, to start with a couple with friends. And before I know it, I'm back to the same habit. And she said, okay, so let's do one thing. If you're serious about taking the habit, why don't we reduce it little by little? So you're at 60 today, let's bring it down to 55. And I found it incredible how she was able to put aside judgment. I don't know what she felt. I have no idea. Did she smoke? Did she not smoke? I have no idea. Probably not. Did she approve of smoking? As an ideology in terms of morals, I don't know. But somehow she was able to put all that aside. So in a way that made a difference to the patient. So he immediately picked up the lack of judgment that was coming from her. And he started taking her a little seriously. And she said, okay, now let's bring it down a little bit. And again, that patient, returned for a couple of months, I think. And by the end of 3 months, he was down to 1 or 2 cigarettes every 2 or 3 days. And also with the continuous healing that was going on to the wound, conservative management of the wound that was in the foot. Of course, combined with the fact that he'd also given up the heavy smoking that he was doing, the wound had almost fully healed. So I think this aspect of the whole experience of this healing process that the physician undergoes is something that I have found very fascinating for myself personally. How do you put aside judgment? How do you put aside, what you feel about something, and pick up on what is right for the other person? So just like, my sir was able to pick up what was right for that man who was alcoholic, just like this person was able to put aside her judgment about, or if she had any, even about this heavy smoker, chain smoker, that has been a challenge for me. And I think that that's an ongoing challenge, I suppose, that where do you end and where does, the person you're interacting with begin? And is it possible to keep yourself separate from your interaction? Is this entirely even possible? I'm not sure. So this is, anyway, we were speaking about experience. So as a subjective thing, this is something that I have found quite interesting in physician-patient relationships. I think that another aspect of the whole physician experience. Now, as a physician, what is my experience with the healing process? I think that this coming upon, how do I put this? I think coming upon establishing a balance of interaction is important, and I'll come to that point last. But I've often found that in my own personal interaction, at least with, patients, for want of a better word, I have found that the best healing happens when the patient places you in the position of a friend. So in the position of a friend, in the sense that not a friend who, whose shoulder I can lean on, or a shoulder, whom I call every day, not that kind of friend. But where the patient himself or herself realizes, hey, I didn't know this, I came upon this, and I think this is really interesting. So I'll just take one example. So I was recently interacting with, a friend's mother, and she had lost 13 kgs over the COVID time, which was a lot. And I was a little worried because she was looking completely haggard. I saw her over video call, and her face had, completely flattened, and she lost a lot of weight. Her clothes were baggy, and her hair was falling a lot, and she was, anemic as well. So I was just surprised because she's been a very robust person through her life. So I was wondering, what was responsible for this. So we went into, the history a little bit, what had happened and all of that. And we came upon, a medicine diet kind of combination for her. And I'm not going to go into what it was or how one went about it, but I think what was interesting in this whole process was that by, I think, 1.5 months, she'd put on actually 4 or 5 kgs, which was a heartening sign. And she was eating much better, and she was eating 3 meals a day. She was, in fact, wanting snack, in between, which was a great sign. And she fed back to me after a point, saying, hey, today I felt this, and if I eat this, I feel very good. Or, can I now modulate the dose of this a little bit so that it's a little better? I find that maybe this is a little too much. So I think this process of interaction with a patient is something that is a very interesting aspect of a physician's experience. And I think at its best, it's this, that, you don't just prescribe something to somebody and then, zoom off or trot off and then forget about what's happened. But that there's this aspect of feeding back. So the person tells you what they feel, that I feel well about this. I'm not interacting very well with this, or I'm not sure how I feel about this. And then, so people are aware of what's happening in their bodies, sensations that they're feeling, what's going on in their stomachs, in their bodies. And there's a sense of ownership that builds. It's very difficult to say. And I certainly saw this with this person whom I was interacting with. And that was a very heartening experience for me as a physician. And somehow in observing her, and also in different experiences that I've had similar to that over the course of the years, I often find myself, as a proxy, wondering, hey, so what's going on with me then? In looking at how people tune into themselves, there's an interesting way that you learn to tune into yourself as well, and you start wondering, okay, so what is it for me? Should I be watching out for this? Should I not be watching out for this? So it's a very interesting feedback that happens between the patient and the physician on the one hand, and also the internal dialogue that happens, at least for me as a physician, when I see especially agency and ownership in patients. So I find that quite fascinating for myself. So yeah, so this is personally the experience of the physician that I would like to, two aspects of the experience of the physician. One is learning to put aside, one's own judgment and one's own conditioning, whether it is even entirely possible. I mean, it sounds very prescriptive, but I mean, at least in a way that is pragmatic and proactive for the patient, at least in a functional kind of way, to find that balance with people is very important, and something I think most accomplished physicians have managed to do in some way. And the second is also to, I mean, my own experience with this whole idea of wellness, agency, and ownership that patients take of their own healing. And I have found this a very, very interesting facet. So coming to just a few, aspects about how a patient might experience this. And again, I come back. So, I mean, this all might sound a little interconnected, because I suppose that's how it is in practice, that, the physician-patient relationship cannot really be, distinguished from what the physician undergoes as an experience or what the patient undergoes as an experience, because at the end of the day, it's just one composite whole. So though I am attempting to speak of them in separate categories, I think this distinction is an artificial one at the end of the day, because the whole process is very composite and interconnected and homogeneous. So anyway, coming back to what I think it might be, what might be the experience of self and healing in a patient. Again, I'm going to draw on a couple of examples to maybe speak about this, both in terms of my own experience as a patient, or I mean, this term patient itself is a little alien to Ayurveda, though we all bandy this term around a lot, that there is, the facilitator of the healing, and there is the health seeker or the well-being seeker or whatever. But I think that would be a more indigenous kind of definition to this relationship. So coming to so a patient's experience, and I have mentioned this example in one previous talk that I gave. And this is the example of a little girl around 7 years old who possessed what is called juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, which is again a very painful inflammatory condition of the joints, except that this is something you're born with. And I found myself, empathizing a lot with her, because unlike many of the cases that we see where, in some way the disease manifestation can be causally linked to something that people have done in their lives, like smoking or drinking or being reckless, or, driving dangerously or whatever. Children somehow escape that, because in many ways, at least causally, they're not responsible for what happens to them. And so seeing her like this at 7 years of age was quite painful, I think, for all of us in the OPD at that time. And so she came in on a wheelchair, which is quite painful for a kid of 7 years of age. And she was unable to walk. She was unable to, even move without pain. Her joints had, contracted in very peculiar ways. And, they were inflamed. And even during the examination, I remember she squealed her heart out, even when, a very brief examination was done. So it was obviously too painful for her to, undergo in any kind of way. And so finally what happened was that she was taken for treatment and she was admitted and all of this. And the truth is that they had come to Ayurveda only as a second option, which is again very often the case, because they had been unable to afford the expense of the allopathy conservative medication, and they could not afford any kind of surgical remedy. And so they had come here because, and I think particularly in our hospital, that is possible because, especially for people who are poor, a substantial amount of, at least in SDM, which is a trust of the Dharmasthala, a lot of the treatment is subsidized for the patient, and the medicine is subsidized for the patient. So it is possibly one of the very few places in the country where people find Ayurveda cheaper than almost any other medical option. So that possibly also explains why so many people approach their hospital, because they find it affordable, and also because they find the treatment helpful for them. So, I mean, that was good, in a kind of sadistic way for us, because we got to see a lot of very, very interesting cases. And this was certainly one that will always remain with me, because this girl was then taken to treatment, and especially in the pediatric ward, when she was taken for treatment, everybody would know, because she would shout her heart out, scream her heart out, because it was so painful for her. And over the course of time, over 3 weeks, the intensity of the screaming came down a little bit. She would not wince so much when examination was done, and she started being able to walk a little bit with support. And she was there for 2 months, and at the end of 2 months she was able to walk, not entirely without pain, but at least to some extent without pain, with the support of her mother. And though she and the treatment had become rather painless in that sense, or relatively painless for her. So this was not like a jaw-dropping kind of transformation, but it was a transformation of some kind. And so she, at the end of this 2 months, which, for them, even that, what they had to pay in our hospital was expensive for them. And at the end of 2 months, her mother was very grateful. She was crying and she said, "Thank you so much, doctor," and all of that. And she gave it to the doctor in the pediatric OPD. And so the patient, so this girl, I don't think she was aware also, but she just thanked everybody, smiled, and went. Of course, she found walking difficult. And I remember asking my teacher after this, 2 months we've given her treatment, and I'm not have we really helped in that sense? Because there's been some sort of mild improvement. Of course, not radiologically, the blood reports also came back. They did show mild improvements. And of course, she was able to walk, which was an improvement, but it was not, a very earth-shattering kind of improvement. So I did wonder, has there been any healing in this case? I don't know. Or was it even worth the amount of effort that went into it? And I think I'll never forget what my professor told me at that point in time, because she said, we've given a 7-year-old hope that she can walk. If that's not healing, I don't know what is. So I remember, being rather surprised at that statement, because one somehow, especially being, a doctor who sees a lot of, being in the medical profession, any medical profession, you tend to see a lot of cases where some sort of a lot of emphasis is given on physiological recovery. Have the symptoms come down? Do your reports show that you're better? Do you feel any better? And if it's arthritis, then are you able to move better? Or, if it's, so depending on the disease, it's a lot of most of the symptoms that one looks for often are physiological. And, with sometimes a token kind of emphasis that is given to the mind, or, and I found this taking me back to, I think, the reason why I was interested in Ayurveda in the first place. That healing itself is it's a very, very subjective, very personal process. And it's certainly not only a function of the physical. And when she said what she said, it did ring me as very true. So this experience of healing, and I'm not in any way trying to decry the importance of physiological recovery, as I've mentioned in several of the examples I've given. And I have had to, take some very, flamboyant examples, if I may, which is a terrible word to use for suffering, but, some very, stark examples, to demonstrate the points that I have. But the truth is that these questions remain irrespective of the cases that present in the OPD. And sometimes it's easier to demonstrate the point that one is making if one takes a more stark kind of example. So this is certainly one aspect of it, this experience of healing, which I think I have not heard from the patient. So I only again have the physician's perspective on this. But I assume that was true, because we all did see it, and we all did experience, and we all did in some small way celebrate with that little girl who could walk. So, so this was something that I found very, very, very interesting for me personally. And so I think, I'll just conclude maybe with one last example that I would like to present before you. And that is a very interesting example And I think it speaks of a very happy coming together of all these, the physician, the patient, and an experience of healing. Of course, it is a success story. I mean, I'm not going to present a failure here, but I do believe that it's not only successes that need to be correlated with well-being. And maybe I'll conclude on this note. So one of this is again a case of Dr. Gangadharan's that we have actually written up and we're hoping to publish as a case report. But what happened, this was a case of anaplastic astrocytoma, which is a brain tumor. And it's one of the most malignant and fast spreading tumors. And its rate of recurrence is very high, even if completely resected or removed from the brain. So he had been admitted in a very well-known hospital, and the head of that hospital has great regard for Dr. Gigi and vice versa. So, I mean, there are several hospitals that, especially being a physician in Ramaiah, one gets exposure to, because there are patients referred from here to there and there to here as well. And so there's a very interesting exchange of, patients and knowledge in that way. And so this patient had only 40% of the tumor resected, simply because the remaining, had 60% of the tumor resected simply because 40% was in a dependent area of the brain, meaning that it could not be reached by surgical instruments without damaging vital brain structures. And so I think the physician realized that, see, I mean, with surgery, this is all that is possible for you at this point in time. And if you would like to explore other treatments, I know a very good Ayurveda physician, and you could definitely go and see him. So this patient then came to Ramaiah, and he started, and I think that what really struck me, because I had spoken to him also as part of this documentation process, what really, really struck me about this guy was the fact that he's one of the most optimistic people I've met. And he was staring down the barrel of death, in the sense that, I mean, one has seen death in the medical profession. It's very difficult to escape death. And often you're also faced with just being a mute observer to people who confront death very seriously. And I have honestly found very, very few people in my life that have had this kind of a positive outlook, and who were genuinely unafraid of dying, and who embraced the very possibility of death, saying, I've lived a good life. So one spoke to him and, took his history, and he was so forthcoming with details. One often finds that with cases like these, patients, feel shame, and especially when somebody is probing them and asking them, oh, how are you feeling? Oh, what is the MRI report? Why don't you send me that? And let's see. So tell me what medicine exactly was changed for you on this particular date, and that kind of, very particular questioning. And he was very, very patient with me. He shared photos of his surgery, post-surgery, recuperation period. And I mean, I was extremely taken aback by just the level of optimism that he came with, knowing fully well that at the end of this documentation process and at the end of this process, he might not even live, And I think that just his attitude had a lot to do with the fact that he completely recovered. And within 6 months of starting the Ayurveda therapy, I think Dr. Gigi Gangadharan, in his usual way, wrought a very beautiful change. And the medicines that he prescribed, the sensitive way in which he changed the medication, because Dr. Gangadharan insists, and this is something again I have learned from some of the practitioners I have observed, and certainly something I have tried to inculcate, at least in myself, that you don't get sidelined by the diagnosis that comes presented to you. So if somebody tells you it's an anaplastic astrocytoma, you don't have to start thinking it's that. For instance, the other case I mentioned also, the case of the patient with the stroke who came to him in Bangalore, he told me that he, completely discarded all of that and said, now let me diagnose him from an Ayurvedic view, because I'm going to treat him with Ayurveda. And I think, he did pretty much that with this case as well. And I think just the fact that he came at it from a different angle, that he gave himself the space to think, it's not that he gave himself the space, that's how he thinks of this case in a particular way. And also, I think the medication that he chose and all of that, because within 6 months, within 3 months, there are some compulsory MRIs you have to take. 3 months after he began, I think it was 3 months, after he began the Ayurveda treatment, against all odds, the tumor size had reduced. And I think by the 9th month after he started the Ayurveda therapy, the tumor had completely disappeared. And he continues to come for treatment. And I mean, just as a follow-up and for different things, but he's tumor-free, cancer-free, and well back to his job and everything. So I think that this particular example, and I'd like to conclude with this, is a very beautiful demonstration of this happy meeting between a physician, a patient, and a successful treatment protocol. Now, there are times when this doesn't work, and it's sometimes very difficult to say why something doesn't work. Because, often when one fails, one finds oneself going back to the procedure. Where did I get it wrong? Have I diagnosed it wrong? Have I missed any symptom? Oh God, or did I choose my medication wrong? Or, have I not accounted for some kind of family history that was relevant or whatever? One finds a lot of self-doubt going on. And strangely, it's not like these doubts are answered when something works either. I mean, of course there's a logical component to it. There's a reason why it worked, and there is always a cognizable reason why something worked. And I mean, of course there is, but I think there's also this element of a happy coming together of a patient who's willing for, or a health seeker, or a person who wills or who wishes for well-being, and someone who is a facilitator of that well-being in a way that that is able to at least partially move away from one's conditionings, and able to look into a patient and see what might be right for them. And I think this is a very intuitive thing. And I think this intuition on the part of the physician, on the part of the patient, I think plays an important role in the whole healing process. It's not prescriptive. I don't know what it is, except to call it an intuition. And when it works, it's very beautiful. And I think, given that the whole premise of this lecture was to speak about experience in Ayurveda clinical practice, I think to speak about intuition, to speak about a subjective experience of what clinical practice has been for me in my interactions both with physicians, as a physician myself, and also with patients. I hope I fulfilled that brief in speaking about my experience. And so thank you all for your very patient listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
So thank you very much, Dr. Pushya, for deriving from your extensive experience in the field of Ayurveda treatment. And although Dr. Gangadharan sir could not be here, we could listen to a lot of stories about him, about your experience of working with him, about how overcoming biases are also important, not just for researchers, but also for doctors especially, and all of that. So along with your experiences, you could also bring in some philosophy as well, which is wonderful. So I think we will now take questions. I see a couple of them in the chat box, but if anybody wants to raise your hands and ask a question, we will take them first and then go to the chat box. So I hope you all are now familiar with how to raise your hand. So yeah, I see Sanjana here. If anybody else wants to do it, you can raise your hand depending on the Zoom platform that you're using. It is either in the reactions option or in the participants option. So first we'll take a question from Sanjana. All right. Sanjana, we are asking you to unmute.
Sorry, can you?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Have we lost her?
Yeah, we cannot hear you, Sanjana. Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes. Yeah.
Hi, Sanjana. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for sharing your experiences with us. I just had a question that I think about quite often because my parents are also doctors, and I come across this question over and over and over again, and I ask everyone I know this question over and over again. So I'm asking you this as well. How do you allow for death and being able to view death, or being able, as you said yourself, sometimes changing the course of death and sometimes being a mute observer to the death of others, to change you as a physician without letting it overwhelm you or desensitize you as a practitioner? And what kind of reflective practices, or what kind of like philosophical questioning, or what kind of reflective practices do you find, do you use, and do you think helps you cope with it? And yeah, those are two separate questions, I know, but it's just, yeah.
Hey, that's a very, very, okay. Can I answer it now? Because
Yeah, go ahead. I mean,
So,
and then we'll take the rest of the questions.
sure. Thanks, Sanjana, for that very, very interesting question. I'm actually reminded of the first death I saw, and this was I think in my final year undergrad. And it was a patient, again, of abdominal cancer. And I mean, we knew that there was not much that we could do for him, but he was about not very old, actually, around 45 years old. And I suppose many doctors, I don't know if I speak for a larger collective, would remember the first patient they saw die. And especially if you're, posted there, and you've seen him, bleed out of the, the catheter, and bleed out of his mouth, and you know scream every time he goes to the bathroom because it's burning. So the first, I mean, I think that it was a very traumatic experience for him as well as for those who are around him, in the sense that the caretakers, his wife who was with him, his son who occasionally came to see him, and also, I mean, somehow the treating physician had become, I think, kind of immune to it and said, yeah, okay, that is to be expected. And somehow one becomes, I think, a little immune to this phenomenon of death, especially if you see it a couple of times. And I found that strangely, I didn't become immune to it in that sense, but somewhere you grow to accept it, which is, I don't know if it's a scary thing, that when you see, you learn to distance yourself from what you see a little bit. Because the first time I saw it, it was like, see a patient die on me, and sometimes there's a little bit of relief that they're out of their suffering, and then there's also this horror at the fact that life is gone. And I think it's different when one learns to dissociate your family from what you see. For instance, the biggest fear of death often tends to be, what if someone close to me dies? And somewhere you realize that every patient is not your family, and patients are close, patients are valuable, but patients are not yours. So I mean, that's in a very selfish kind of way, I think, one way of dealing with this question of death. I think another, I mean, area, at least, that one tends to see, especially in cases of patients, is when people suffer a lot. When you see them suffer so much through life. For instance, often with cancer, or with, I mean, what are some other cases that, of course, I mean, old age. In fact, we saw a number of cancer cases actually that have come to the hospital during my study there. We saw a lady with cervical cancer, and she didn't even know she had cervical cancer. She was from a village, and she had nobody. And she would just come and, sit there. She would catch a bus and come. She barely had enough money for the bus. And once I remember, when I was posted in the obs and gynae posting, she just gotten up off a chair, and it was full of blood because she just bled through, and then we did a test and realized that she had cervical cancer. So, and somewhere, when death happens, then when death happens to people who have suffered through life, when death happens to burn cases that are burnt beyond, recognition. There were one case at least that I saw through my study that was like that. And sometimes it's a very counterintuitive feeling, but you feel relieved that they don't have to go through that suffering anymore, Other than that, for me, how I personally look at death is, I mean, at least some of the philosophical questions, I think, which was the second thing you asked about death, was, I mean, I have found myself, at different points wondering, is there, an afterlife? Can one ever wonder if, I mean, if somebody has lived a very, pained or difficult life, can we hope for some kind of redemption in the future? Is there some kind of continuity? But these are questions I find myself asking, and I often don't find satisfactory answers, because either they get very prosaic, and then we get into one lecture about afterlife, but I don't know, that is not satisfactory either. So yeah, that's just my
Okay. Thank you, Doctor. We have two more questions. Two more people have raised their hands. Perhaps we will take them both and then you could answer. And before that, may I also request the team to share the attendance form so that people can mark their attendance as well. It'll probably be shared in the chat box soon. So yeah, I'll request Narasimha Murthy to please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, thank you, doctor, for sharing your experiences. Like, yeah, my question is like, what kind of differences in patients you see, other than like rich and poor who visits Ayurveda center? Like the difference in patients, what kind of patients? So I thought, like a lot of people, they prefer the allopathy, the regular medicine, and there is definitely something special or something fascinating, whoever visits Ayurveda. So I just wonder, you could put some thought into it. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you, doctor.
Thank you, Narasimha, and I'll take Varun's question next. Varun, are you there? Please go ahead.
Yeah. So my question is, I have two questions. First one is about this idea of assisted suicide, which is sort of, not common, but it is legal in some countries like Switzerland, and if I'm not wrong, in Canada, where there is no hope of any improvement and the person is suffering immense pain and suffering. Like in the cases of terminal cancers, or even in cases like ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, where you know that death is certain. So how do you personally, as well as Ayurveda as a medicine, as a branch of medicine, see assisted suicide or active euthanasia? And second question is not that related to the first question, but it is the question that is close to my sort of heart, in the sense that I'm interested in near-death experiences. And I have studied some of both the aspects, both the facets. Those who believe that there is some possibility, like there is a doctor, there is a physician known as Sam Parnia, and then there is a neuropsychologist, British neuropsychologist named Dr. Peter Fenwick. He has written good books on art of dying, and so they are sort of not that skeptic. They say that near-death experiences shows that somehow your consciousness survives your body. But majority of the neurologists and the fraternity, they say that it's the product of your dying brain. But then there is a possibility that there is another question, that in so many cardiac arrest cases, the person is literally dead, if I'm not wrong. So how do you see this enigma of near-death experience? And the first question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Varun. We'll also take a question from, I think, Dr. Saurabh. So could you introduce yourself as well, if it is Dr. Saurabh or
Yeah.
any other?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Pushpa, for the wonderful lecture, and it was really illuminating. So I was, this is not a question, but this is I would like to listen your views on this. Recently, I was having a discussion with one of my friend. She's doctor in Switzerland, basically psychiatrist, and she has been recently working as a Doctors Without Borders in Greece, and where she was especially like dealing with the people who are the victims of violence, especially of the torture. And during the course of that conversation, she said one interesting thing, that I was asking her that how could she like counsel these people, and how could she like maintain her equilibrium while dealing with this. And she said that it was difficult because in order to understand the torture, she had to read so many books on the torture and all this, and even the people who are like in the camps, they were even raped in the camps, also women. So it was kind of a very disturbing for her. And one thing she said that it actually shakes the faith that there is a justice in the world, or there is a metaphysical agency which does the justice. Now, I see that in allopath doctors, these kind of the cases, like the victims of the violences, dowry cases, many of these cases come and through their professional training, they are neutral while dealing with all this. How to, when these kind of the cases when comes, when there is a victims of the violence, torture and all these things, so how does like the Ayurvedic patient, what is their like professional or like traditional training? So in what way that there is some modernity in this Ayurvedic tradition to dealing with these kind of the these very recent modern problems? So that is just I would like to hear from you.
What a very interesting question. I'll answer backward if that is okay. Thank you, Saurabh sir, for that very, very interesting question. I think what you said about, I think this idea that, I mean, I'll just address it broadly. When you use the word modernity, there's a thought line that started. And that was that often Ayurveda is considered an ancient science because the texts that we study are 3,000 years old, or 2,000 years old, and they're all in old Sanskrit and all of that. And I think somewhere, as Ayurveds as well, and I'm speaking here very honestly about our community as well, that sometimes it's possible for us to get a little carried away with this notion of the romantic past, and when actually, I mean, as a science, it has evolved to meet, you know, modern day demands. So the looking at the properties of burgers, looking at the properties of pizza, looking at the properties of new diseases. I mean, treating new diseases like HIV or new types of cancers, or like you're saying, substance abuse. Of course, torture. There's nothing new about that, but all. So in that sense, the science has evolved, and I think in attempting to make it distinct from a more maybe recent system of medicine, a far more recent system of medicine like allopathy, which I think is important. I mean, I think that there is a value to that kind of tradition, but I think also we get carried away with that and not really give enough focus to how it has evolved and how it has evolved to meet changes, because it could not have survived had it not adapted in that sense. So thanks for bringing that point. And I mean, that's, of course, this is a separate area and an area that I am also interested in, but I just felt like putting that out. So with respect to victims of domestic abuse or torture, I have personally not seen a case of maybe rape or something like that, or at least not a case where someone came out and wanted treatment because they had been raped. I have never seen a case like that. But I have seen cases of domestic abuse. Yes, we did get a couple of those. And we did also see, I think, a burn case that had resulted from domestic abuse. And often the way that Ayurveda would approach this, at least, is one of them is always, I think, to speak with the patient. And there's nothing new in the sense that you speak with the patient. But it's not that one remains neutral to the patient or anything like that, but there is an enormous amount of focus, especially because that person has been very severely tortured as well. So we do have a counseling center, at least in SDM we did have one, where patients were sent to speak. And one of my teachers, whom I have learned a lot from in this area, Dr. Professor Suhas Kumar Shetty, he's dean of that department now, and he will be speaking as well on this area of Ayurveda in mental health. So, so definitely there is some counseling that happens in that way. And I think that whenever, especially with treatment, when treatment is advised for such a patient, or because often people can react very, very strongly, and especially with people who are a little fragile because of the kind of experiences they have had, it's a little volatile to deal with them, especially in terms of what you would prescribe to them, and also just how they might respond, because some of them have left, they will just walk out and not come back again. So And also, especially if they're alone and they have come without support, to stay in a general ward with a number of strangers might be a little scary for them. So these are all things that I think one takes into account, in a practical kind of way. And so one always makes sure that they have a support system that is there with them, that they can trust. And whenever a treatment is planned, that both the attender and as well as the patient is taken into account, saying, hey, see, this is what we're planning. Are you okay with this? How do you feel? And especially in the initial sessions, etc., one sees that, often people start crying. And I have personally seen that, when people cry or break down or rant, that's better than some people who might just sit mute, and say that everything is fine. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. There's no problem. No. And like that. So it's easier to get through to these people. It's easier to work through whatever it is they're going through, especially if people are able to speak and emote with respect to where they are. And also, I think working through therapies, especially with such people, in such a way that they feel that they are taking the initiative. I think especially in this way, this whole idea of agency in the patient, because often with abuse or torture of any kind, what one loses in a very fundamental kind of way is this feeling that you have any say in what happens, especially when your body has been violated. It leaves a kind of very fundamental scar. And to help people rediscover that sense of agency, saying, hey, you can take a call about what's going on with you. How are you feeling? What do you want to do? Where do you want to be? I think just giving them that sense of agency, working the treatment with them instead of to them, makes a very, very and unique difference in such cases. So, this is there in Ayurveda texts as well. The sense of giving agency. Ayurveda believes that everybody has agency. A plant has agency. An individual has agency. The question is, how is this translated in practice? And in practice, practically, this is what I have observed. That people who have been violated, people who especially have undergone physical abuse of any kind, whether it's children or whether it's women, not often men, one certainly sees that helping them discover or working their agency with them is something that is very important. So coming to the question by Varun. Sir, I hope that answered the question. So
Yeah. I think this is a brilliant, and your agency. I think this is. I think this is a very nice way to understand the whole context of this agency. I will talk about it more later. Thank you for your response.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So coming to Varun's question, I think you asked me two questions. One was what about euthanasia and Ayurveda. Honestly, I have not in Ayurveda texts, ancient or recent, come across any references to euthanasia per se. But so, this idea of, whether it's okay if a patient wants to give up his or her life to do so, I think it's a case by case basis. It'll be what the patient wants. It'll be also, what is right for people. So for instance, I did see this case where there was this old lady, she was about 90, 92, and she'd just come there to, she thought Dharmasthala is a holy place and wanted to give up her life there. And she told us also, I have nothing. I just feel my end is near. And that was a very interesting story. So her daughter was away traveling for something, and her daughter could not be there. And so, in fact, she told, I think my friend who came and told me, she was very shaken that day. She came back to me and she said, she said that my daughter, she cannot let herself die till her daughter comes. And she was, on drips, and, she couldn't move basically. She was fed through a tube and all of that. But she hung on just so that, and her daughter came, I think, a week later, and her daughter was there for 2 days, and on the second day, she passed away. So I think that, why I gave this example is that, see, this whole idea, because she wanted to die, if we had, sanctioning, it's a very case by case basis. So her daughter needed her, she realized her daughter needed her. And then after that, if she had made peace with it, how one would go about it is different. So I think on a case by case basis, it's very difficult for a doctor to take that moral responsibility of saying, yeah, you want to die, and willing to take your life, because often the families are involved, often, especially family is involved. So it's especially, when it's a very close other, like if there's a daughter and a mother, and if the daughter wanted her mother to live and the mother wanted to die, what would the daughter do? So these are not questions I'm raising anew. These are questions that have been raised overall with respect to euthanasia, and also whether it's right, to voluntarily take somebody's life, and how it's different from murder and all of that. But I mean, in my own personal experience, I think that it's a difficult line to walk. I haven't thought about it. I probably have to think about it to give you a more cogent answer. Coming to near-death experiences and how Ayurveda understands near-death experiences. So I think that there are certainly, I mean, in Ayurvedic thought at least, there is this idea of the Dhananjaya prana, and that there are the 5 pranas that, the 5 main pranas and the 10 upapranas that traverse the body, and that also give this body that vital life air. And it is said in some yogic texts, which has not been mentioned in Ayurveda, though it has been mentioned in yogic texts, that the Dhananjaya, I think it's Dhananjaya or the Devadatta, I think it's the Devadatta prana that leaves the body a couple of, some time after the body has physically died. That is, after the vital organs have, the functions of the vital organs, such as like brain death or the heart stops beating and all of that. So is it possible in Ayurvedic thought, in the system of Ayurvedic thought, that life or breath or this awareness or consciousness lives in the body after physical death? Is that theoretically a possibility? Yes. I mean, in Ayurvedic thought, in the sense of pranas and the doshas and dhatus, and within the theoretical context of Ayurveda, is it possible? I think so, yes. How other, psychologists or other people see it, I have not studied, so I can't compare, but in Ayurveda, at least, there is the possibility, there's a scope for something like this, yeah. Narasimha ji, your question was about why do people come to Ayurveda, and is there anything unique about Ayurveda? Was that the question? Or how do we see patients aside from rich and poor, or something like that? I'm not very.
Like the difference between like what kind of patients, and also like, see, like if some patients go to regular hospitals and some patients come to Ayurveda, there must be some difference between those patients, right? So like what kind of difference you see in the patients,
Patients?
In patients, yeah. What kind of patients come to Ayurveda care, or,
Sir,
like apart from rich and poor, of course, rich might go to 5-star hospitals, and poor they can even go to government hospitals, or they can come to Ayurveda. I'm just wondering, what is the human psychology behind, going to Ayurveda, going to the regular hospitals, I'm not sure whether, I mean it correctly or not.
I understand your question broadly, sir. I mean, I think I understand the question, but honestly, I must say that I don't see any difference in patients who visit different hospitals. I mean, in the sense that we get people who come to Ayurveda because they hope that it can help them in some way. And that, in that sense, is the only kind of person, people who come to Ayurveda hoping that it will help them. It's not necessarily true that they have a particular religious leaning, or that they have a certain bent to spirituality, or that they have a particular lifestyle. Unfortunately or fortunately, no such categorization can be made. It's just that, I mean, they come to Ayurveda as a medical system hoping that it can help them in some way. And the definition of help maybe changes. Maybe that's the best case scenario, that what you come seeking something and then you maybe take back a little more, or something different than what you came expecting. I think that is maybe the only contribution.
Because some people, they don't want to go, they don't like Ayurveda kind of treatment. I have seen this, so that's the reason I asked it. I think it makes sense. What you answered makes sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Narasimha. I'm sorry, Narasimha. And I think we have one more question from Ms. Vishakha Sen. So if you would like to go ahead and ask Ms. Vishakha.
Audible?
Yes, you're audible. Go ahead.
Hello, ma'am. You have done justice to what Dr. Gangadharan has been practicing all through these years, and you all being carrying their legacy ahead. So my question is that, of course, there are these particular aspects in Ayurveda and in our body, and that's how it is a very individualized healing that you all approach. That's what I have understood. Uh, in any way, of course, it sounds utopian, but in any way, can we say that a person who is, of course, who has suffered a lot, but still, if they are positive or they are optimist in their approach, uh, at times, maybe not introvert or extrovert, but how they perceive things, does it help in healing? Of course, you have answered a bit when you said that it is all up, it is based on agency as well. That when we become the agency and we should be, that you have mentioned. So that was my only question and query, that if you all as physicians and doctors also help in creating that. Of course, you have also mentioned many examples in your lecture. So how far does it help in healing process? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. The way I have understood what you're saying is, does patient optimism, does positivity in a patient, to what extent does it contribute to the healing process? I think it contributes significantly. I mean, again, whether it translates into a physiological response or not, and I assume it does, because a lot of happiness studies now, that is a separate area now, that very, very interesting work is going on in the psycho-endo-neuro-immune axis that Dr. Ramanohar spoke about last time. So there's some very interesting findings that people have. When people are happy, sleep patterns change. They measure vagal tone, they measure heart rate, and they measure heart activity, and there are a lot of other things, that the brain activity. So I definitely think that there are studies now that prove that the more positive you are, the happier you are. Certainly the outcome is better. But I would go, one step further and say that I think that, at least from a clinician's point of view, now, whether physiologically you see a difference or not, I think an individual's experience of healing is much more enriched when there is optimism. And when there is this sense that, I will get better, or it doesn't matter what comes in, and I will take it with a smile. And I think I have seen this in a number of people through my time studying and also my time practicing. And I think whenever I've seen this, and it's not that every time I've seen this, there's been perfect cure. So, this is not a utopic, like you said, it's not a prescriptive thing that every time you're happy, you get cured completely. It's not like that. But if you're happy sometimes, and I've seen terminal people, and let me now flip it, people with terminal cancer. So it's not necessary that all people with terminal cancer are, just waiting for death or anything like that. So in fact, we had a case of a very young man, actually around 38, who had cancer, and he had third stage cancer, I think, of leukemia, or I'm not sure. And he was he was positive, he was volunteering, he was saying, can I volunteer, and can I do this, and what seva can I do here, and let me be of some help. And do you need help serving the patients, do you need help? And he was one of the most proactive people I saw. So whether being happy or being positive and being optimistic translates into full cure, I certainly would not go so far as to make a statement like that. But I think that being optimistic, I think, contributes immensely to an experience of healing that an individual may have.
Thank you. Thank you, Vishaka and Pushya. We'll take a question from Suja Swaminathan. Suja, we are trying to unmute you. Are you here?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, please go on.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Pushya, for your talk. My question was, since we know that mental health and physical health is related, when you do come across cases like borderline personality disorder, which is very difficult even in conventional psychiatry to cure, and when you see some cases of some depressed cases where there is intergenerational trauma, what is the approach that Ayurveda takes for dealing with this?
I have not seen any cases of borderline personality disorder. I must be honest, I have not seen any such cases. So I do not know how, I have never seen them treated before. So I don't have a practical experience of how such cases might be treated. With depression, definitely, I think that is certainly cases that one has seen quite a bit of. And I think that the approach to depression again would be a combination of psychosoma. So there would be a combination of counseling, there would be and as well as physical therapy. And I think this is probably what is unique to what Ayurveda has to offer. Because Ayurveda, first of all, would not ever see depression or any kind of personality disorder as something that needs to be suppressed. There is no question of suppression in Ayurveda. So, it's not that, okay, let's just get rid of the offending neuro, chemicals, or let's just get rid of, and if this person is being a bother because he or she is behaving a particular way, then let's just subdue everything and, make them conform. So that is ideologically, again, completely against how Ayurveda would see an individual. So given that is the case, and also given the fact that, actually, this is something that, again, Ram Manohar sir mentioned in the previous lecture. He says, Sharira Manaso Yukta Taptajya Ghatayoriva. So the body and the mind are like a clay vessel that is lined with ghee. So you heat the pot, you heat the ghee, and you heat the ghee, you heat the pot. So there is no, difference between the two. And I don't personally have, there is no difference between the two. They're two interlinked. So you deal with one, you deal with the other. And I'd like to quote maybe one case here. I had treated a case of, he was also depressed. And this was actually someone quite close to me. And, he said, I'm just sitting, like, had very vivid images about how this would be. And he also has a family history, like you're saying, of depression and also being on medication for depression. And I think just one of the things that I found it possible to say, and again, this is not a prescriptive thing, but because he kept saying, I feel like I'm trapped. I feel like I'm in a cage. I feel like I have no way out. And he had considered suicide, as I think everyone does at some point. But at that point, I think that often one finds that the pattern of breathing in depression, the pattern of breathing in panic are all very characteristic, that they become either short, fast breaths, or they just become, the person breathes there's very little oxygen that enters the body. So just to change up the pattern of breathing as a way of changing the mind. In fact, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika says, chale vate chale chittam nischale nischchalam bhavet. So when the Vayu or this prana that we speak of moves, so does the mind. And, when one learns to control the breath, then does one learn to control the mind. So there's a very intrinsic link that Ayurveda and yoga see between the breath and the mind. So just learning to breathe, and I just suggested a few brief breathing exercises. And I think, in that particular instance, that worked. Because, and he was still in school at that point in time. So now he's just passed out. So they were asked to write one word that described their year. And the word that he chose was breath. So I think that was very telling. And I think that there is no prescription at the end of the day, but I think certainly breath would be an important part of any thing that happened with the mind.
Thank you, Dr. Pushya. And I think we are running a little short of time, so we might be unable to take the questions from the chat box. But what we can do is we will open up the WhatsApp group and we will take all the questions that you want to ask there. So please do share your questions once more in the WhatsApp group, and they will be answered by Dr. Pushya. So I think if there aren't any further comments, Dr. Pushya, would you like to say anything more? Any other comments?
No, I don't have anything to say. Thank you. I'm glad that I enjoyed the discussion session as well. And thank you all for interacting. Thank you so much for being here. And again, next time you'll see me on the other side of that screen, welcoming you all and introducing the speakers. So looking forward to seeing you all next time.
So thank you so much, Dr. Pushya. I have to thank Dr. Sankita Menon, first of all, for organizing this platform for us, and team CSP who works relentlessly in the backstage facilitating all of this. We have Niharika Sharma, we have Abhishek Srivastava and Ashwini ji, all of them who are working to facilitate this course. So thank you everybody, and thank you all for your participation, for turning up for all the classes, and see you again for the next class. And I should particularly appreciate Dr. Pushya for giving us this lecture and filling the gap that Dr. Gangadharan could not be here today. So thank you very much, Dr. Pushya, and thank you everybody again. All right, see you all next week.